The Dark Scrolls. They say that in the Tang dynasty, when the empire stretched wider than any heart could ever contain, a single woman's beauty had the power to set it all aflame. If you believe the poets, and perhaps you should, her face was so luminous that blossoms blushed when she passed. Her laughter made the moon tremble, unsure of its own reflected light, and her name would echo for centuries, woven into ballads and cautionary tales alike, Yang Guifei. But she was not born into legend. Once she was only Yang Yuhuan, a girl whose life began in the quiet corridors of a modest household. Her father was a minor official, respected but unremarkable. There was no prophecy etched into her cradle, no sorcerer whispering of a destiny that would topple emperors. Yet from the moment she first stepped into the world in the year 719, something in her eyes hinted at the turbulence to come. Her earliest days were gentle, almost forgettable. She was taught the manners befitting a daughter of the gentry, how to lower her gaze, how to pour tea, how to recite verses about the constancy of virtue. But somewhere behind those lessons there was a yearning she could not quite smother, an ache to be more than a decorative vessel in a well-ordered house. The chronicles do not say whether she knew the price that hunger would eventually demand. When Yang Yuhuan reached her adolescence, the empire itself seemed gilded with prosperity. Emperor Xuanzong, known also as Li Longji, reigned over a golden age, one of art, poetry, and trade caravans laden with treasures. But even an emperor, with the world balanced on his fingertips, could be struck down by longing. He had already outlived his beloved empress Wu Hui, and though he was no longer young, he had not grown immune to desire. In that yearning, fate found its first fissure. Yang's beauty ripened early. It was said that when she played the pipa, her slender fingers brushing the strings, men who overheard her music felt their hearts bloom and wither in the same instant. She moved like drifting silk, her voice soft but certain. Inevitably, such loveliness could not remain hidden. Her family arranged for her to marry Li Mao, the emperor's own son. By all accounts, she was dutiful to her husband. She smiled when she was expected to smile. She walked 2 steps behind him in public. She played the part perfectly. But some truths refused to stay buried. One day, as the court prepared for a ceremonial performance, Emperor Xuanzong caught sight of her. Some chroniclers insist it was during a dance rehearsal. Others claim he merely passed her by chance. However it happened, in that moment, when their eyes met, history took a breath and began to tilt. She was no longer simply the prince's wife. She became the flame that would consume them all. It is easy to paint Xuanzong as a villain, a predator who coveted his son's bride. But to imagine it so simply is to deny the undercurrents of longing and loneliness that swirl in every human heart. He was a man aging past his prime, carrying the weight of an empire. She was a woman radiant beyond reason, and perhaps she saw in his gaze the promise of a life unbound by duty. Perhaps she glimpsed her own reflection magnified, desired, exalted, nearly divine. Or perhaps it was nothing more complicated than the oldest of all hungers, to be loved without limit. Still, their bond could not be declared in daylight. If she remained Li Mao's wife, Xuanzong could not take her openly. So the court devised a pretext, a vow to become a Taoist nun. In name, it was a gesture of piety, a ritual cleansing. In truth, it was only a thin veil to cover a scandalous transfer of affection. When she entered the temple, her hair was bound under a novice's headdress, her slender frame draped in plain robes. But no cloth, no prayer, no holy incantation could disguise her allure. The emperor visited her often, claiming he came to pay respects. And every time he emerged, his attendants whispered that he seemed younger, livelier, as though her presence was a fountain of youth he alone could drink. Months passed in this delicate fiction. Then, when the requisite mourning period ended and the public memory dulled, she was brought to the palace as a consort, in fact, as well as in feeling. The ceremony was sumptuous beyond description. Silk banners streamed from the eaves. Musicians played 1,000 flutes in perfect harmony. The emperor declared her Yang Guifei, precious consort Yang, a title few women in all of Chinese history would ever share. In her new chambers, she was surrounded by servants whose only purpose was to attend to her every wish. Pearls were sewn into her pillows. Rare perfumes drifted in the air, mingling with the scent of peonies. And when she walked through the palace corridors, courtiers pressed themselves flat against the walls, their eyes lowered. She was not merely a woman anymore. She had become an omen, an embodiment of a love too fierce to coexist with reason. Yet, even in her triumph, rumors gathered like storm clouds. Whispers claimed she was not satisfied with her own elevation alone. Her family, especially her cousin Yang Guozhong, began to rise too, carried on the tide of her favor. Officials grumbled that the emperor had lost himself in her arms, that he no longer cared for the burdens of governance. It is true that court business often paused when she summoned him. It is true that ministers waited for hours outside locked doors, wondering whether the empire itself was being ruled from her scented bed. But in those first days of her ascendancy, Yang Guifei seemed untouched by the resentment she inspired. She was young, she was adored, she had everything she had once dreamed of, and so much more. Perhaps she believed her story would remain a romance forever, a golden legend without a tragic ending. Perhaps she did not yet sense how swiftly power becomes peril. Some nights, as she reclined against embroidered cushions, she would take up her pipa again. The notes floated through the darkened chambers like sighs, sweet and mournful. Even the guards in the outer courtyards were said to fall silent, straining to catch the echoes of her song. And if she sometimes wondered what price the heavens would demand for so much happiness, she did not speak of it. She only played on as though music itself could postpone the reckoning. For a time the illusion held. The emperor called her his lotus, his moon, his solace in an unkind world. Ministers dared not defy him. The empire continued to glitter. But beneath the surface, old rivalries festered. Soldiers grew restless. Ambitious men like An Lushan watched and waited, sharpening their plans in the shadows. History was stirring, preparing to awaken with claws outstretched, and Yang Guifei, still only in her 20s, stood at the very center of it all. A girl no longer, a consort crowned in splendor, a woman whose beauty had begun to unmake an empire. Time has a way of transforming passion into peril, though those ensnared inside its golden cage seldom recognize the bars until it is far too late. As months blurred into years, Yang Guifei's hold over Emperor Xuanzong only grew more absolute. What began as an infatuation became something darker, an enchantment that no council, no crisis, no plea for moderation could break. In the official records, ministers tried again and again to reassert their influence. They brought petitions. They cited precedents. They begged the emperor to remember his duties to the realm, but he would not hear them. Some said the moment Yang Guifei laid a hand upon his sleeve, his resolve dissolved like frost in sunlight. Others whispered that she had bewitched him, though surely the truth was simpler. He simply could not bear to let her go. By then, her family had become as much a force as she herself. Her cousin Yang Guozhong rose quickly in rank, faster than any man without noble pedigree should have dared. He was clever enough to disguise his ambition beneath a mask of humility, but even the most innocent pretense could not calm the resentments that gathered in the corridors of power. Enemies multiplied with every promotion, every new favor bestowed by the emperor's hand. In the evenings, when the palace lamps flickered low, the conspiracies began to coalesce, threads of anger twisting into a single rope. Still, within the scented walls of her chambers, young Guifei seemed untouched by this mounting dread. She kept her own household in meticulous order. She commissioned poets to compose verses praising the emperor's kindness. She spent long hours in her bath, attendants pouring warm water perfumed with orchid blossoms over her skin. Sometimes she would think back to the days before all this, before the crown, before the longing that changed the shape of her life, and wonder if she would have been happier as an ordinary wife. But then the emperor would appear, and his gaze would sweep away every doubt. He called her his treasure, his solace, his destiny, and she believed it. How could she not? He had made her into a legend while she still breathed. He had granted her family power beyond imagining. Together they had crafted a dream so bright it dazzled them both. But beyond the palace gates, another man was rising, a man who watched her with a hungry calculation that would one day devour them all. An Lushan, the adopted son of the emperor's favorite concubine, was no ordinary general. He was half Sogdian, half Turkic, with a ferocious charisma that made soldiers adore him and ministers quake. He had a gift for survival, an instinct for intrigue, and above all, an ambition that would not be satisfied by titles alone. Some said he envied young Guifei's hold over the emperor. Others believed he was seduced by her beauty, though whether he ever truly desired her or merely used her as a symbol of imperial decay remains an open question. What is certain is that, in An Lushan's mind, the empire had grown soft, rotten with luxury and distraction, and nothing embodied that softness more perfectly than the emperor's devotion to a single woman. At first, An Lushan played the role of loyal servant. He lavished gifts upon young Guifei, calling her his mother, a term of respect that also placed him within her sphere. She laughed when he visited, charmed by his blunt manner and the exotic dances he performed to amuse her. In the candlelit halls, she applauded as he spun in elaborate silken robes, unaware that he studied her every reaction, testing the boundaries of her influence. Perhaps if the emperor had been more vigilant, he might have recognized the danger. Perhaps if young Guifei had guessed at the depth of An Lushan's hunger, she would have warned her lover. But such caution would have required a humility neither of them possessed. They believed the empire existed to serve their happiness. They thought their passion was unassailable. They did not see that it was already the crack through which calamity would pour. By the year 745, the strain on the imperial treasury had grown impossible to conceal. Lavish entertainments, new palaces, staggering gifts to Yang's relatives. The emperor taxed the peasants mercilessly to maintain the illusion of endless abundance. Drought compounded the misery, as did corruption among officials emboldened by the court's negligence. Riots began in the provinces, bandits multiplied along the trade roads, and still the emperor would not leave her side. The chronicles say that even when he did hold court, he insisted young Guifei be present, her face veiled in fine gauze, her eyes downcast but alert to every movement in the hall. Ministers resented her interference, but none dared confront her outright. To oppose her was to risk imperial wrath. To criticize her was to invite exile, or worse. So they plotted in whispers while the empire cracked beneath the weight of neglect. Through it all, young Guifei remained an enigma. Was she truly oblivious to the suffering her elevation caused? Or did she understand all too well and simply choose to enjoy her moment of splendor, knowing it could not last? No account agrees entirely. Some describe her as vain and manipulative, quick to reward her allies and destroy her enemies. Others insist she was a victim of her own legend, a young woman carried along by forces far beyond her control. Perhaps the truth was both simpler and more tragic. She was human, and no human can bear to be worshipped without losing something essential. In the autumn of 755, An Lushan finally made his move. He declared himself the savior of China, the avenger of all who had suffered under the corrupt rule of Yang Guozhong and the emperor's bewitched court. His army surged southward with a speed and ferocity that stunned the capital. Whole garrisons surrendered rather than resist. Cities fell one by one. Refugees clogged the roads. Farmers, merchants, noble families all fleeing the storm. Inside the palace, panic reigned. Ministers scrambled to assemble defenses. Loyal generals were dispatched in haste, but their forces were pitifully outnumbered. In the chaos, Yang Guifei's cousin Yang Guozhong made the fatal mistake of underestimating An Lushan's determination. He promised the emperor that all was under control, that the rebellion would be crushed swiftly. But each dawn brought new reports, closer and more dire. At last, in the dead of winter, Xuanzong could no longer deny the truth. The dynasty itself hung by a thread. And still, even as he prepared to flee, he could not bring himself to leave Yang Guifei behind. They rode out together under a sky heavy with snow, surrounded by what remained of the Imperial Guard. The road south was choked with bodies and wreckage. Frost bit through their silks. The emperor, once the most powerful man alive, looked back over his shoulder and saw Chang'an, the jewel of the Tang, surrendering to flame. And beside him sat Yang Guifei, silent and pale, her hands hidden in the folds of her robe. In that moment, she was no longer an empress in all but name. She was a woman marked for sacrifice, a living symbol of everything that had gone wrong. She must have known, then, that the price of her beauty had finally come due. At dawn, the imperial procession halted on a narrow mountain pass, wind shrieking through the cypress trees. Snow clung to the soldiers' helmets. Horses stamped restlessly, their breath rising in white plumes. No banners flew, no music played, only the bleak hush of defeat. The emperor, wrapped in sable against the cold, sat motionless in his saddle. He had not spoken in hours. Ahead, the path twisted south toward exile and uncertainty. Behind, the ashes of Chang'an drifted over the horizon like a funeral shroud. It was here, on this desolate road, that the courtiers could no longer bear the unspoken truth. Their fear of the rebels, of the starving army, of the empire's ruin, had boiled over into a single desperate conviction. Yang Guifei had to die. They approached Xuanzong with trembling voices, as if appealing to a father too frail to protect his own child. One by one, they fell to their knees in the snow. They spoke of the soldiers' rage. They warned of mutiny. They insisted that only her death could appease the army's hunger for vengeance. He listened without lifting his eyes. Perhaps in that moment he realized there was no argument left to make, no plea that could undo the years of indulgence that had led them here. History has tried to measure what he felt then, whether it was sorrow, guilt, or simply the exhaustion of a man who could no longer pretend he was still emperor. But some chronicles claim that as he gave the order, a sound escaped his throat, a broken, wordless cry. Yang Guifei did not resist when the guards came for her. She stepped down from her litter with slow, deliberate grace, as if each movement were a farewell to the life she had once ruled. The wind tore at her hair. Her silk slippers sank into the drifts. Some said she smiled, a small, impossible smile, as if to reassure them all that she understood, that she forgave them. They led her to a secluded grove beyond the road. The cypress branches formed a dark canopy overhead. No one knows what words passed between her and the attendants tasked with ending her life. Some stories insist she asked them to care for the emperor. Others claim she spoke no words at all, unwilling to diminish her dignity with pleas or curses. At last she knelt among the roots, her robe spreading around her like a withered flower. A length of white silk was drawn taut, the final gesture of devotion, to die without forcing the emperor to witness it. When her body was laid in the frozen earth, no monument marked the place. Only the whispering of the trees remained to carry her memory. When the soldiers were told she was gone, a hush fell over the camp. In that silence, the emperor bowed his head and wept, not as a sovereign, but as a man who had loved beyond wisdom. They said he could not rise for hours, that he sat in the snow while dawn turned the sky to fire, mourning the woman whose beauty had unmade him. The days that followed were a hollow parade of defeat. Xuanzong relinquished the throne to his son and became a shadow in his own dynasty. He withdrew behind screens and silk hangings, refusing the company of those who had once flattered him. He ate little, he spoke less. The empire struggled on, bloodied, fractured, but alive. But for the old emperor, nothing survived the mountainside where he had betrayed the only love he could not live without. In the years to come, legends grew around Yang Guifei's memory. Some claimed her spirit haunted the roads south of Chang'an, a white-robed figure glimpsed among the cypress. Others said her body had never truly been buried, that loyal servants had stolen it away to a hidden sanctuary, where she lay preserved in secret, beautiful as the day she died. Poets took up her name as a symbol of all the perils that attend desire. They wrote of her face that eclipsed the moon, her voice that stilled the birds, her death that shamed an emperor and stained an age. Yet, to imagine her only as a ruinous temptress is to deny her humanity. She was, in truth, a girl who once dreamed of a gentler life, a consort who loved the man who made her powerful, a woman who learned, too late, that the favor of an emperor is as dangerous as it is intoxicating. Even now, when scholars trace the downfall of the Tang dynasty, they mark the moment of her ascent as the beginning of the end. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.